Students, as promised, I'm going to try to give you some insights and some advice and some guidance on doing individual lesson plans. My goal for this is to help those of you who have not had the introductory course, to give you a template and some guidance on that template. And for those of you who have already had Education 556, to help you all just to review and to also reinforce the things that I value for lesson planning. So let's talk about a few things that I'm going to ask you to think about. First of all, a lesson is hard to plan as just a standalone. In instruction, if you think about it, there shouldn't be just a single lesson. A lesson should be an integrated and an integral part of a series of lessons, whether that's a unit, or, whatever people choose to call it. But we plan instructional sequences. We don't plan just day by day lessons. So subsequently, it's kind of hard to do what you're being asked to do for your clinicals, in that you're asked to prepare a lesson that you're not there for the entire instructional sequence. You may not be there the day before the lesson that you're going to teach. You're probably not going to be there the day after the lesson you're going to teach. And that's kind of not a real life look at what teaching is going to be, but it does at least give you some experience in planning a lesson. So I highly encourage you to talk with your clinical teacher and make sure you have a vision of his or her unit plan, that instructional sequence, so that you fully understand how your lesson fits into that sequence. As I have tried to say each time we've met, I hope that you will think mostly about what are my students going to be doing. Remember, the worker is doing the learning. If you're doing the work, you're the one doing the learning. If the students are doing the work, they are the ones doing the learning. So don't think of your lesson as what am I going to do, but think of it as what is it that my students are going to be doing. That concept is reinforced by this visual, and I just wanted to include it on here because I think about what I'm doing with you right now. I'm doing lecture basically with you right now, and that means that if you only heard me give this talk about planning lesson plans, you would probably not retain any of it. So I want you to think about that as you are planning your lesson. You're just talking and disseminating information is not going to translate into much student retention. Notice the more and the more deeply that they engage with the content and with the skills you want them to learn, the higher the likelihood that they're going to retain what you're trying to teach them. We've not really gotten into talking about how to plan for successful science instruction yet, but I will tell you it doesn't matter what subject it is. The number one thing that's key for a key lesson is that you as the teacher have a very clear understanding in your mind, in your instructional design, about what it is the kids are to learn or the skill that they are supposed to learn to do. You also need to know if kids can do that. How would I know it? What would students be doing? What work product would they be creating? What activity would I be observing if students could do what the objective of the lesson is? Then, after you know that, it is your goal, it is your job then to communicate that to the students. And sometimes you got to do that in multiple ways. That's writing it on the board. It is saying it to them explicitly. Perhaps it's having them to write it down. Perhaps it's having them to write it in their own words, however you want to do that. But if students don't know what the goal of everything they're doing in a lesson, then that lesson is not going to be successful for them. So your students also need to know how it is they're going to demonstrate mastery of that. I told you that you need to know what it looks like when students have mastered the content or have mastered the skill. Students need to know that from the very beginning. One of the big misconceptions about assessments is that kids don't need to know their assessment. That is so not correct. In order for kids to learn, they need to know what they're going to be able to do at the end. What does mastery look like? So you need to communicate that to the students at the beginning. So, what steps should you go through to plan instructions to help students be better academic achievers? Well, first of all, you've got to figure out that goal, that objective. And to do that right now, I wanted to do this slide because in your clinicals right now, the current course of study for Alabama was developed in 2001, and that would be 14 years ago, so it's very old. It was updated in 2006, but actually none of the standards were updated. I am not a fan of this course of study. It is a very low level, not very engaging course of study. However, those are the standards that students in our classrooms now in Alabama, that's the minimum standards that they are supposed to be learning. So as you're planning for your clinicals, you need to reference the Alabama course of study, the current one. However, when we do our lesson plans in this class for our unit plan as our culminating assessment, we will be using the draft of the new course of study, which I haven't shown you yet, and that one, of course, is based on the next generation science standards, and that's why we're spending so much time learning what that conceptual framework looks like. So what does a good lesson plan, what is it like? Well, it is like a delicious sandwich, and I hope that looks good to you. But a sandwich, if you think about building a sandwich, we're going to use that as an analogy to building a great lesson plan. And when we think about building a sandwich, the first thing we've got to get is our bread. We have a top piece and a bottom piece. And just like this top piece and bottom piece of this bread frame this sandwich, the top piece and bottom piece of this instructional planning will frame your lesson. So the top piece of bread, the beginning of your lesson, how you start with your students, is what I've really already spoken about. That is where you establish the goal, the purpose for your lesson. That's where you let kids know what they're going to be learning that day. You tell them at the end of this lesson, when you walk out of the door, you will be able to blank. You also let them know what they will be doing to demonstrate mastery of that lesson. Will they be taking a microscope slide and getting it into focus under 400 times? That would be an example of a skill mastery. Or will they be giving an example of each of Newton's third laws from real life? That would be a written example. Or will they be able to explain to a partner the products of photosynthesis? That would be a kind of vocal one. If you're using technology, they may be able to answer 3 multiple choice questions using clickers or some other type of signaling device. So you're going to tell kids this right at the beginning. Once you tell them what the lesson is about, you got to figure out what they know. And this is really key with you all going in to teach these clinical lessons because you weren't there the day before. Chances were you weren't there for several days prior to your lesson. Where are kids in their background knowledge about what you're going to teach? So you're going to have to probe that through questions, through something you would have students to do. If there is an essential question that is part of this lesson today, so for example, when I think about canister conundrum, there was a big essential question. What is the mass of the paperclip? What is the mass of the canister? And what is the mass of A and B? Those were the essential questions for that particular exercise. So you get kids understanding what their next 50 minutes, if it's regular schedule, 90 minutes if it's a block. These students now have a clear picture of everything they're going to be doing is wrapped around this main goal, this main concept, with the idea they'll be able to do this thing you have described to demonstrate mastery of that. So now students have the top piece of bread. They've begun to frame the lesson. The bottom piece of bread is, of course, the bottom frame of the lesson. What happens at the end? Well, obviously at the end of the lesson, the key part is that a teacher as well as individual students, know to what degree they have attained the goal or objective of the lesson. So there are some suggestions here to the right that give you ideas of things that you could have students to do. Here's where you're going to want to know as the teacher what's on the plate for tomorrow, because tomorrow's sandwich is going to greatly depend on, did we master today? Are we going to need to repeat, review, etc. tomorrow? This, of course, could be formative assessment. It could be a type of summative assessment. But here are some suggestions of things that you could have students to do. By the way, it's also important that kids know, were they able to master that content or not. But of course, a sandwich would be pretty boring if all we had were 2 pieces of bread. Most people consider the meat the best and the most substantial part of the sandwich. So let's talk about the substantial part of your lesson. This is when, notice the first bullet, that kids are actively engaging with the content. And students, that can take just hundreds of different forms. However, remember, I want to say again, this is where kids are doing the work. You are not the person on the stage that everyone is staring at. Certainly that can be part of your lesson, but the lion's share of your lesson needs to be students actively engaging with the content. Now, to be frank, in your clinicals, that could not be what these students are accustomed to. That still doesn't mean you shouldn't give your lesson plan a try. But please know, if it's not successful in your clinicals, that may be because you have not had the chance to teach your kids to learn in this kind of environment. You all told me in our blog post that most of you have been students in classrooms where teachers did most of the work. So there's a good chance that your clinical class could be like that as well. But here are some suggestions of things that you could do in the middle that would actually engage students in your content. Meat might not be the only thing that you would like on your sandwich. It surely makes it more tasty and more enjoyable if we have some tomatoes, some lettuce, some onions, and pickles. And so there are just an unlimited number of teaching resources and strategies that you can use to add a little bit more taste to your lesson as well. I'm going to make this available, this presentation, this document, available in our shared folder, and those things that you can see that are hyperlinks will take you to a YouTube video that talk more about that particular strategy. The ones that do not have a hyperlink, you can certainly go to Google and Google those ideas and learn what those are about as well. By the way, this is not an exhaustive list. These are not necessarily my favorite things. These are just some suggestions that I have for you. And finally, our sandwich might be pretty dry if we didn't have some condiments. And there are just a lot of ways to put variation into your lesson. You can have teacher-led questioning. You can have students working alone. You can have students working in groups. You can have actually different students doing different things based on their interests, based on the way that they learn, based on their readiness for the content. You can have them demonstrating their learning in a variety of ways: reading, writing, talking, investigating. All of these are good, and the good thing about this part is it helps to create some variety in your lessons. Use different ones on different days. So students, let's review. We've got to frame our lesson. What do we want students to know? How are they going to show that at the end of the lesson? On the other side, we have the end of our lessons when students reflect on the lesson and give evidence of mastery or lack of mastery of the things we wanted them to learn in some way. And in the middle, we have a variety of ways for students to actively engage with that content. Now, if you ask your supervisor teacher out in your clinicals to look at his or her lesson plans, they may have beautifully written plans. But they also may have plans that really don't have a lot of substance to them. But that's, a lot of times that's because these are teachers that have taught a while. As the longer you teach, the more intuitive this planning gets. But I will tell you, for a student who's just now beginning their teaching, it would be very important for you to make pretty detailed lesson plans. The more details you get in there, the more details you get about how you're going to transition from one activity to the other, the more you say put in things like pass out this handout now, etc. I will tell you, the more successful you're going to be in your lesson. I've always heard people say you should plan way too much, then you will never run out of anything to do. And so I see that, but I want to tell you, students, one of the things I see as the biggest problems with lessons is that we don't get to that end piece of bread. A lot of times the bell rings, we're in the middle of the lesson, we didn't get finished, and students walk out without any kind of closure, without any tying it back together, without really looking at, did the students learn what I wanted them to learn? So I want to encourage you to monitor your timing and certainly make certain you get to that part of the lesson. I hope this is helpful for those of you who needed a refresher or a first look at lesson planning. You certainly may email me, text me, any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.